Today we're taking a dive into the background simulation and we're going to talk about the steps you need to take in order to take over a station. Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Elite Dangerous with Down to Earth Astronomy. Today we're talking about BGS, and this is going to be one of the first real videos in my BGS guides, which hopefully is going to be an ongoing series. And today we're going to go over the basics you need to know in order to take over a station in a system with your player faction, if you have one. Now, this is an extremely complicated topic, and the amount of information that you need to know everything would be way too much for one video. So there will hopefully be more videos on this. So I'm just going to go over the basics now. A lot of the information that I have is from various forum posts, and I'll link to some of them in the description below. And a lot of it is also from running my own player faction. And from talking to my faction planners, which are helping me, and we're discussing daily what kind of actions we should take to try and increase the influence of our faction. Now, as an example today, I've gone over here to Inara and I open up the system Paula. Now, this system here, there's this faction here called Paula Purple Syndicate. Anarchy system, so an anarchy faction. We're going to pretend that this is going to be the player faction we're going to use today as our proxy. So this is going to be the one we're going to use to try and take over. And let's say we want to take over Vandenham at the hub. Now, before we begin to go in and have a look at all the state and the influences here, in order to update this, you would have to get the ED market connector and then fly to the systems in-game and then update that information, which would then, if you set it up correctly, be sent over here to Inara, and you would then have the information updated. Information updates every day at 1 o'clock in-game time. Sometimes it takes half an hour to an hour before it's properly updated in-game, but often it will happen around 1 o'clock in-game time. Okay, so here we are. We are Purple Syndicate, and we want to move up, and we want to take over the station owned by State Interstellar. Now, in order to take over a station, you need to initiate a conflict. And there are three types of conflict in the game. There are war, civil wars, and elections. Now, the difference between wars and civil wars is if the faction is native or non-native. So, for instance, Paula Interstellar is native to the system, whereas a faction like Social Faust is not. So, if these two were to go into a conflict, it would be a war. But because we are also Paula, we're also native to the system, Paula Purple Syndicate, that means we will go into a civil war. Now, if the factions had the same government type, for instance, these two, it would go into an election instead of a war, regardless of whether they were native or not. Same government type, they would go into election. The difference between those states, I will come back to those later on in the video. No, okay, so in order to initiate a conflict, you can do two things. Either you can try and match influence with the faction you want to go to conflict with. You need to stay within 5%, and if everything else aligns up, we'll come back to all this later, you would then go pending, and you would then have the state start after a few days. Again, more info coming later. Alternatively, what you could also do is you could just boost your faction up over 60% influence, at which point you would go into a conflict with the controlling faction in the system. If you, of course, the controlling faction yourself, nothing's going to happen. And if the faction you want to take over the station is not controlling the system, then you would go into a conflict with the wrong faction. So often you would have to try and match influence, but in some cases you can just boost to 60% and then initiate the conflict like that. Okay, so obviously we need to boost our influence. We are at 2% and they are at 48%, and we need to stay within 5% of them to initiate the conflict. But we can see there's a lot of factions in between, and as we move up, we will move within 5% of these other guys. So, and we don't want to start an accidental conflict with them. We're not interested in that. So we would have to make sure that we did a little bit of legwork beforehand. Now, the two first factions here, we can see they are both below 5%. If you're below 5%, you cannot go into a conflict in the system. So these are not going to be a worry to us. So we can ignore these for now. So that means we just have the social lines and we have PV Hydra left. So let's open up social lines first and have a look. We can see that these are in 3 systems, all in all, and they are not in a conflict in any system. Conflicts, or actually all states, are global. That means if you are in a conflict in one system, you cannot go into a conflict in another system. It would be a blocking conflict or a blocking war. So that's exactly what we want to happen here. We don't want to be able to, we don't want an accidental war with the social alliance here. So what we could do is we could head over to, we can see here we have a yellow indicator here saying they are already within 5% of another faction. We can open up here and we can see indeed they are within, they are very close to another faction here. So we could potentially just start a conflict between these two guys, and while they were busy fighting over here in this system, we could then, in the other system, pass by them and not be in the chance of starting a conflict over in Pavla. So let's have a look at these guys. It does not look like they are in a conflict anywhere. Now, when matching influence, it has been theorized that you need to cross influence. You can see here, if we zoom in a bit on this graph down here, we can see the influence has actually been close for a while, but they have never started a conflict, which might indicate that you would have to flip the influence of the two. So you would have to make sure that the organization here got higher influence than the social. Some people seem to disagree with this. We have seen situations where sometimes you would have to flip it in order for it to initiate the conflict. In other situations, it would just happen on its own. So it's a little confusing exactly what triggers it. But flipping the two would definitely be a good place to start if you wanted to try and initiate a conflict between these two guys. Okay, so that's one way to do it. And alternatively, we can see, let's have a look at PB Hydra as well here. You can see they have a lot of systems, but they're not really pending. If they were pending a conflict, they would have a red warning light here. And again, we could go here to this system, could be a good candidate. Smaller system is easier it is to influence. The fewer missions or less trade you have to do to gain a lot of influence. Same thing here. We could go and move these guys up for another influence. If we just have a look at these influence, these are not in any other system, so we could use those as well. Alternatively, which would probably be a lot easier, we'll just do it in our own system. So run missions, for instance, for the Social Alliance, boost those up until they match influence with the PB Hydra, and then start a conflict between those two guys, in which case we could then freely pass by them because they would be too busy fighting each other. Okay, so now let's say that we clear the way. We have set blocking conflicts in the other systems, and we're now ready to begin to increase our influence. Now, before we do that, of course, we also have to have a look at the state interstellar. So let's quickly go, I'll close some of my tabs here, and have a look at state interstellar. And immediately we see a problem here. We have a red warning light here from HR 3991. And we can see over here that interstellar, here they are currently in election, which is a conflict state, with Purple Fortune Company. Okay, so we can see here that they are currently in an election, but they are already 5% apart, meaning that the election is already ending. Now, it's not already ended. We can go into the graph and actually see when this conflict started. Let's see, can we see that? It's actually quite difficult. So what we would have to do is we need to clear this, because this, as long as they're in this election over here, we cannot start the conflict in our own system. So it would probably be a good idea to head over here and run some missions for Paula State Interstellar, and to move them out of this election here. Now, before we do that, we need to look at some graphs from some of the posts that I will show you down below. For instance, right here, this is an overview of the different states and the timers. You can see here, for instance, election. It has a pending time of 3 days. That means when you get locked into the conflict, the election conflict or war, civil war, they will be pending for 3 days before it actually starts. Now, as soon as you're pending, you don't have to stay within 5% any longer. You can move away if you want to, and already there begin to increase your influence. And that means that as soon as the conflict goes out of pending and actually starts, you could already have a large enough gap to win the conflict. It will still last for the minimum length of 3 days before it will end, but you could then essentially win the conflict before it even started. You can see here it says +1 here. The +1s is in case that that one of the factions, or in case the losing faction owns any stations in the system, there will be 1 day of asset transfer where the conflict will still be going, but it wouldn't be ended because there's like handing over stuff. You have a maximum length, and then you have a recovery time, which is how many days or how many server ticks would go before you could go into that state again. And okay, so if we wanted to go and clear Paula Interstellar, we can see here that there is an effect of election that combat mission has no effect. So that means if you're running combat-related missions and actions, they do not contribute towards your influence. So you have to go and do something else. You would have to hand in cartography data or run other types of mission. If, of course, that is the Paula state that still owns a station in the system. Let's see, do they do that? They do not. So they don't own a station, so we can't do any trade, and we can't do any handing in exploration data. So we would have to just run missions, and it would be something else than combat missions for this to properly work. So as soon as we cleared them over here, and they have gone out of election, we would then have to wait for our 2 days, 2 ticks, so 2 server ticks, before we could initiate our own conflict, because we would probably have to wait before they could clear that out, so we could go into another state again. So let's jump back to Power here, and let's say that we have now cleared the, it's been a few days, let's say, and we have cleared the conflict. They are no longer in any conflict in any systems, they're not pending conflict in any systems, and we have now moved up, and we have now matched our influence. Now, again, looking at, you can find these images in the forum post I will link in the description as well. You can see here the effects that the different states have. So for instance, right now purple is in famine, so you can see here that combat missions and actions do not contribute, so no combat missions when we are in famine. But trading in food has double effects, but again, we don't own a station at this point, so we can't really go and do trade. Okay, so once we're logged into the conflict, we will then have to run that through, and once the 3 days of pending, 3 days of conflict, and the 1 day of asset transfer is over, so 1 week, 7 days, Purple Syndicate will now be the owner of the station, and it would probably go and become an anarchy system, because this is an anarchy faction, so you couldn't change the system like that. And that's the brief overview of what you would have to do. Now, there's a lot more to it in terms of how this whole influence increasing work, but that's going to be for a separate video later on. But for now, at least, that's the basics of how you take over a station and how you initiate a conflict. So I really hope you learned something today. If you did, remember to give the video a like down below, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, I will see you guys in space.